Okay, we still got a few people signing on here, but it's time to get started. So we'll go ahead and do that. So the Karst Waters Institute would like to welcome you all to the second in our Frontiers in Karst Colloquium series, where for now we're highlighting a series of talks that have some relevance for carbonate critical zone processes. And we're doing this in collaboration with the Carbonate Critical Zone Research Collaboration Network, Research Coordination Network, um, sponsored by NSF. And I went ahead and put up all three talks here for the fall. If there were some of you who weren't able to make this first talk, it's now up on the Karst Waters Institute website, karstwaters.org, and you can go check that out. We'll also be putting these other talks up in a recorded format as well. With that, I would like to introduce today's speaker, who is Dr. Stephen Brantley from the Jones Center at Ichauway. And I'll give you a little bit of background here on Stephen. So he got both his BS and his MS in biology from Virginia Commonwealth University. And then he continued on there to do a PhD in integrative life sciences as well. And then for 4 years, he was a postdoc working with the USDA Forest Service. And now he's an associate scientist at the Jones Center. And today he's going to be talking about what has the greatest effect on tree water use, a prescribed fire, a hurricane, or a solar eclipse. So let's welcome Stephen.
Thank you, Matt, for that introduction. Let me share the right slide on here. Let's see. I may have to start. Let's see. Not sure how I got on the last slide. So while I'm scrolling back through this, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to do these kinds of online seminars. I actually hosted one of these for the Kawashi group a few years ago, and that was, long before COVID, but I think it was fun to bring together, people from diverse places in this kind of format, even before we had the social distance. It really gives us opportunities to share ideas. And today, that's really what I want to do. I am a plant physiologist and ecosystem ecologist by training, and about 6 years ago came to the Jones Center Ichauway from Coweta Hydrologic Lab. And if you know anything about water budgets, you probably know some of the work from Coweta, and the fact that it's based on the the watersheds, the basins being perched on granite stone that's impermeable, and so that you can really get a good measure of water budgets for a whole watershed just by measuring flow out at the base of the watershed. And coming to the Jones Center, it was very eye-opening to be in a karst landscape where we have a large stream running through the property, but it's not it's basically one stream with no tributaries. It's groundwater driven largely, and it's a very complex system hydrologically, and it makes my job as an eco-hydrologist pretty tough. But today's seminar really is just sort of a fun side project, talking about some of the work I do in the terrestrial part of the ecosystem, related to tree water use or sap flow. Let's see. Okay, so why study tree water use? What determines tree water use? How do we measure it? And then I'm going to go over some case studies of water use during what I'll call rare or unusual events. The world's
for
water.
now, we still can't see your slides.
Oh, you can't? You're not seeing?
No.
Okay. Let's see. me see.
That looks promising. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, can you see that?
Right now I see your whole PowerPoint window. So I think probably if you put it in presentation mode, we'll.
Let me see.
Or whatever you did a minute ago.
Yeah, I know we had
you
it.
did a test run
We
and
had
everything
it in
was
the
working.
press. Let's see. Screen 1. How's that?
Still just seeing the PowerPoint window.
Okay, let me start this over. It always works in the test run. Okay. Are you seeing the split screen now?
Right now you're not sharing screen, I think.
Okay.
That now it's working.
Okay, are you seeing the split screen or
just a single slide?
Just a single slide. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, back to it. Sorry about that. Here is the outline again I just mentioned, and so I wanted to start this sharing this picture I saw online just a few weeks ago from USGS, and I kind of call this the other thin blue line, but it really demonstrates how limiting a factor water is on the Earth. If you look at all water, 97% of water on Earth is salty. What's left of that, 2/3 of it are frozen. And then so that leaves us with about 1% of water in groundwater and soil and in lakes and rivers to use as humans. And we need water. We need water for hygiene and for consumption, but we use water for a ton of other things. We're in Southwest Georgia in a very rich agricultural landscape where we use center pivot irrigation to grow pretty much all crops. Dependent on center pivot, which is what you see in the upper left. We use water for transport. We use water for recreation. We even use water for our spiritual needs. So water is very important, but water comes in spurts. Usually we either have too little water or too much water. This is the top panel shows a graph of the Palmer Drought Severity Index for our site, which I'll talk about in a minute. And usually we're either in a deficit or we have too much. In the bottom left, you'll see a picture of Ichauway Nachaway Creek during a severe drought, severe multi-year drought in 2012. This is a stream that usually runs at about 700 CFS on average. And here it's probably at about 5 CFS. And then on the right, you see a picture of Georgia during the 1994 flood from a tropical storm that stalled over the southern part of the state. So usually we either have too much water or too little. In our area, so I work at the Jones Center. We're a private nonprofit in Southwest Georgia. We're based on an old quail plantation. It's outlined in red. I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, but this is Ichauway. And then the hashed area is the Daugherty Plain region. But we're a 30,000 acre former quail plantation owned by Robert Woodruff of the Coca-Cola. He was a Coca-Cola CEO for about 50 years. And he established this site starting in the 1920s. And upon his death, it became a research and conservation and education center. And so our main focus is on longleaf pine restoration, on wildlife habitat restoration, and then also on aquatic ecology. We have right down the middle of the property is the Ichauway Creek, and then we border the Flint River, which has been in the news in reference to some Supreme Court cases. But what you'll see is that the landscape we're in is highly agricultural. All these red outlines are agricultural row crops that are fed by center pivot irrigation. And so that center pivot is a very demanding form of irrigation. This is a very productive area in terms of water from the upper Florida aquifer, and it's a very productive area in terms of crops, especially cotton and peanuts, and then also corn. And so agricultural water consumption tends to go up when natural water inflow, in other words, rainfall, is sparse, and this creates some big issues in terms of water scarcity in the region. We've done a lot of work with ag and with the ag community to reduce water use, but there's also some room to grow in terms of conserving water through management of forest. And so that's why one of the big reasons that we measure tree water use. And then these bottom two pictures are just illustrating that we are in a karst landscape. This is the bank of the Ichauway Creek, showing the limestone where it's incised into the limestone, very porous material. And then this picture actually was just taken yesterday to show you how active the karst system is. This is a grad student measuring the depth of a new sinkhole, and this sinkhole just formed last week on one of our fire breaks. So it's a very active karst system, but the main focus for the rest of us today is going to be on tree water use. Why tree water use? Well, tree water use is a huge part of the hydrologic cycle. I superimposed these fluxes onto a karst diagram. Of course, it's much more complicated than this, but basically you have incoming rainfall. The top arrow, you have some water that's lost through interception, which is just rainfall that collects on leaf material and evaporates directly before ever reaching the soil. And then you have tree water use, and then what's left over from that can go into either stream flow or groundwater recharge. And so in our area, based on numbers we see, we get about 1,300 millimeters or 50 inches of rainfall a year. We lose more than 10% of that from interception. Long-term data show that we have a combined yield from streams of about 350 millimeters, but the biggest flux is through transpiration. This 800 millimeters is typical of a lot of the forest types we have in the area, whether they be natural or plantation type commercial forestry, I'll say. But what's neat about it in terms of a management perspective is that 800 millimeters can be reduced through certain types of forest management. So restoring longleaf pine and prescribed fire and some of the other things that we do here on Ichauway, we can reduce that to as low as 500 or 600 millimeters, and then that can work its way into groundwater and stream flow. So what determines tree water use? It all goes back to your basic ingredients for photosynthesis. We need sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water for photosynthesis. Water is taken up through the roots into the stem, and it's used metabolically, but most water that's lost from a plant really just escapes as a byproduct of being of the plant taking in CO2 from the atmosphere. So you have little guard cells that control the opening and closing of pores on the leaf surface to take in CO2, and that's where the water loss comes in. And so that's what really drives plant water use. What are some of the weather factors or climate factors that affect it? Soil moisture can have an effect. Uh, Generally, soil moisture is not a limiting factor in this ecosystem. Um, but when it gets dry enough, it can limit how much water is available to the roots and thus to the stems and the leaves. Of course, solar radiation, because it drives photosynthesis. It also directly triggers those guard cells to open the stomata. But that said, plants can transpire at night. Stomates can be leaky, especially as the plant ages or as the leaves age, or just certain species can leak water. And so plants can actually transpire in the absence of solar radiation. And so what really drives or transpiration or tree water use most of the time is vapor pressure deficit. This is basically a measure of the drying power of the air. It's positively correlated with temperature. So the hotter it is, the higher the VPD goes, and the lower, it's negatively correlated with relative humidity. So the higher humidity, the lower VPD. It's measured as a pressure, and the range we usually get is from about 0, which would be early morning on a humid day, up to about 4.5 kilopascals, which would be a very hot, dry day. Vapor pressure deficit is a measure we use to measure the dryness of the air, because dry air is what pulls water up against gravity. It basically creates a negative pressure between the soil, which is much more moist than the air. Even under very high humidity conditions, the atmosphere can hold a lot more water than a soil, even a relatively dry soil. So we call that gradient water potential, and you can see here that a moist soil might be 0.1 megapascal. It's actually a negative unit because it's a pulling pressure through the plant. Typical leaf water potential we see here, and we do measure this fairly regularly, is about -1.5 at midday. And so not a huge gradient from soil to leaf. But then when you hit the atmosphere, even under very humid conditions, -7 megapascals, and that under very dry conditions, it can go up much higher than that. And that's basically what provides the pump to bring water up through the tree. How do we measure tree water use? We measure sap flux, or we call it sap flux, just to sort of disambiguate what level of sap flux or what type of sap flux I'm talking about. This blue arrow is the uptake of water from roots through the stem, through the xylem of the stem into leaves. And that is actually what makes up most of the volume of sap. There is sap that flows down the tree in the outer, very thin layer of cambium. That's what a lot of people think about when they think about maple syrup, or in our area, when the pine trees will start throwing sap onto your car in the parking lot, which is annoying. But that type of sap and that amount of sap is actually very small. Even at its highest, it's going to be less than 3% of total flux in the tree. So really what we're talking about is water moving up through the xylem material of the tree. We measure that. There are several ways to measure it. One of the preferred methods that we use oftentimes is called the Grenier method, or thermal dissipation. And we create these probes in-house from a design that's been around for about 35 years. But we basically have two thermocouples that are inserted into hypodermic needles, and those are inserted into the active xylem of a tree. One needle is heated by a wire that we run a current through, and that current creates heat. And the other is basically a reference that's just measuring the temperature of the tree, the natural temperature of the tree. So we wire this together to create a difference in temperature between the heated probe and the unheated or reference probe, and we measure that delta temperature. We basically connect the probes to a data logger and measure continuously or really about every 15 minutes. We can measure more than that, and then we convert it to flux by what's called the Grenier equation, which I'll show in a minute. And so higher delta T actually equals lower flux. The way that works, this is a 3-day course of raw delta T data. When a lot of water is flowing up the tree from transpiration, that water will carry away heat, and the delta T between the two probes will go down. And then as that water declines, or that flow declines through the tree, the delta T will go up as more heat is in the area of the heated probe. And then at the peak of each day, where you see the maximum delta T, you assume under certain conditions, under certain weather conditions, that means that there's zero flow in the tree. So that delta T data is converted through an intermediate step where we calculate a dimensionless unit called K from delta T max. That could be the maximum delta T for the day or for the week or for a given period around the time of the measurement. And then we use the delta T. We then use K in the Grenier equation to calculate flux. Fairly simple equation, and this form of it gives us grams of water per centimeter squared of wood per 15 minutes, and that's what's reflected in this sap flux graph, and that's what the units will be for the rest of the talk, basically. So with that background, I wanted to talk about water use during some rare weather events, and you know, this was sort of an opportunistic study. We've been monitoring sap flux for about 5 years in 2 and now actually 3 different sites, mostly in longleaf pine, but also in some other species, some oaks and some hardwood. Most of what I'll talk about today is in longleaf pine. But we had some opportunities here to look at how sap flux varies during some unusual events. Some are just for fun. Prescribed fire, though, is something that we use on Ichauway a lot. And so prescribed fire is really our main management tool. We burn between 12 and 14,000 acres every year just here on Ichauway to control hardwoods and to maintain biodiversity of our ground cover. But the question always comes up, well, what effect does prescribed fire have on tree health and even on water use? Prescribed fire can have a number of effects. If it's a very intense fire, leaves could be consumed. This rarely happens here because we don't let fuel build up. We burn most of the site on a 2-year rotation. So we don't have the ladder fuels like you see out in some of the wildfires in California or Oregon that will bring fire up into the canopy to consume the leaves. But these potential effects are basically listed from most severe to least severe for all these cases. Number 2, leaves could be damaged from heat. It actually doesn't take that much heat to denature chlorophyll. I think 3 or 4 minutes at 50 degrees C is enough to denature chlorophyll. And when you consider our weather, you know, that we're already at about 37 or 38 degrees C on a typical summer day, it doesn't take much additional heat to heat up the canopy. 60 degrees C just for a few seconds will actually cause needles to brown. Less severe than that, the stomata will simply close and the tree will stop using water. And then last, heat from the fire will increase air temperature, which increases VPD, and that will cause the tree to use more water because there's a greater gradient into the atmosphere. So what we did in 2017 in the spring, we knew this prescribed fire was coming through working with our land managers, and we had talked to some various people that had never really been able to pull off the logistics of measuring sap flow during a fire. As far as I know, I don't personally know anyone that still has done this. So these are some fairly unique data. we limited our measurements to 4 mature longleaf trees just due to logistics, and we changed our normal sampling interval of sap flux from 15 minutes to 1 minute. So the second event that we wanted to look at, and this was much less important, I'll say, than the prescribed fire in terms of interest, but just something that happened here, was the Great American Eclipse back in 2017. So an eclipse, the effects on plants are kind of obvious. Light is going to decrease during the eclipse. That's going to reduce photosynthesis, and temperature also decreases, which will cause a decrease in vapor pressure deficit. So this happened on August 21st, 2017 at our site, which is denoted by the red star. We got about 90% coverage at the peak of the eclipse. The reduction in sunlight lasted about an hour total from start to finish. And really, we just had to download the data and analyze it. We did this for what at the time, all the trees that we had, which was 22 canopy trees in 2 different sites, and plus the MET data we have from a local climate station. Number 3 was a hurricane. Of course, again, from most severe to least severe, trees get snapped or uprooted. That basically severs the connection to the soil. The tree dies, and of course, there's no transpiration. Even if that doesn't happen to the trees you're measuring, leaves get blown off or damaged. We actually had 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago exactly, Hurricane Michael pass over us as a strong Cat 2 storm. It damaged about 20% of our trees. Luckily, none of our sap flow trees were damaged or heavily damaged. But the second point, that year, Hurricane Michael happened on October 10th. So there was, probably 3 or 4 weeks of growing season left where we are in South Georgia. But after Hurricane Michael passed through, basically all the trees stopped using water. And that was probably because the leaves were damaged from the high winds and the abrasion, and maybe just the shock. And then low sunlight, high humidity during the storm itself could also reduce water demand, during the storm. This is something we typically see with a summer thunderstorm. And then number 4, though, is actually what's more interesting to me and what I'm going to be talking about for hurricane effects. And that is the fact that distant storms in this region, in other words, a storm that's not directly hitting us, but is hitting somewhere along the southeastern or Gulf Coast state coast, tend to cause these shifts for a few days in the regional wind direction. And for our site, that brings in much cooler, much drier air. And so the case study I'm going to actually talk about here is Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas about 700 miles away from our site. Normally in the summer, our weather pattern is dominated by the Bermuda High. That Bermuda High, the circulation brings in southern air off the Gulf Coast or off the Gulf of Mexico, and it results in very hot, very humid conditions for most of the summer. But when hurricanes form either on the Atlantic or sometimes in the Gulf Coast, they can change that because of the extreme low pressure. The effect on the entire region is that wind direction, wind is going towards the center of that storm. This is Hurricane Dorian from, I think that was just last year. And this is from a site called windy.com, which is a fun site to visit if you're interested in meteorology at all. But we got a strong northwest wind during Hurricane Dorian. I don't have a screenshot from Hurricane Harvey, but what we have looking back at the climate data was we had a very strong northeast wind, bringing in much drier air than we typically see in the summer. And so that could have an effect on sap flow. So what actually happened during the prescribed fire? Not much, actually, and this is actually kind of comforting to us and our land managers about the effects of fire on water use and on tree health and tree physiology in general. The x-axis here is in minutes, so we have about 16 hours worth of data during the single day of the fire. This is one sensor. This is the flux data. And what you'll see is that there was a slight uptick in sap flux for about 5 minutes as the flames moved underneath the canopy and consumed the ground cover fuel, and the temperature heated up. And we saw out of our 8 sensors and 4 trees, we saw 2 or 3 with this pattern where there was just this slight uptick in sap flux. And then the rest of the trees showed this pattern where basically, you know, in the morning, they're usually increasing their sap flow as it gets warmer and sunnier. And as the fire moved over this tree, it just basically stopped stopped increasing its water use for just a few minutes. And so that's really neat. Again, it's comforting. It's shows that the prescribed fire and the overall prescribed fire program here does a nice job in managing fuels and keeps these fires at a very low level of intensity. And so it really doesn't affect, at least in this case, the tree water use. The eclipse, the results here may be a little bit anticlimactic, but we can look at solar radiation and see that it changed just as predicted, about 90% decline. Temperature went down about 3 degrees over that hour where sunlight declined. Vapor pressure deficit decreased about almost 40%, about proportional to where it should. And then wind also died down completely during the eclipse. So we would expect effects on sap flow from these changes in weather. And we saw exactly that. So this is 3 days worth of sap flow data. This is just one example tree. And we can see that dip in midday sap flux when we should be peaking. We actually see about a 40% decline in sap flux, which is almost directly proportional to the decline in VPD. So if anything, that just confirms that you know, all of our theories are correct, and that the drivers of sap flow in trees like VPD and temperature and sunlight are all right there and working as they should. Hurricane Harvey, the last event, had some more, I'll say more interesting effects on weather. Sometimes when hurricanes pass through the southeast, and if they don't hit us directly, they actually result in some very pleasant weather. That was exactly the case here. We saw temperatures actually dip below 90 for a few days in August, which is fairly rare. If you live in the South, you know what I'm talking about. Relative humidity, which usually peaks at night at 100% or near 100%, didn't reach 100% for 3 nights in a row, and one night it actually only reached up to about 78 or 79%. That's pretty unusual for this area. We usually have very heavy dew in the morning because the temperature drops to the dew point. And then concurrent with that, vapor pressure deficit at night for 3 nights in a row never dropped to 0. So what effect did that have on sap flux? Basically proportional to VPD. Sap flux the 2 nights before Hurricane Harvey hit never reached 0. And then on the night of the 28th of August 2017, sap flux actually stayed relatively high. Like I mentioned earlier, tree water use can happen at night. Transpiration can happen at night, especially if the plants have leaky stomata, or maybe, you know, this was a late growing season storm, and later in the growing season, plants can't regulate their stomata as well. So basically, the atmosphere is driving water use, and the reason this is important is because not zeroing out at night in sap flow, this little area down here, if you think about the area under the curve and how it increases, this is a significant increase in total daily water use from this change in wind direction. So what's the takeaway from all this? All of these events showed a measurable effect on tree water use. From a methodological perspective, that's just comforting that, hey, we know what we're doing, and our theories are working out, and our measurements seem to be working. The hurricane had a much greater effect than the eclipse, which had a much greater effect than the prescribed fire. I think that would surprise some people. I will say that this prescribed fire had a negligible effect on tree water use. That's not to say that every prescribed fire will. And there's also the potential that there could be greater effects after the fire, either from increases in albedo in the stand as everything's charred, or from leaf consumption. You could see increases or decreases after certain fires. But this fire really was not much to speak about. The third point here about shifts in wind direction, this is something that I think is maybe more interesting, especially for the concept of critical zones and climate change, and thinking about whether or not climate change causes or could cause shifts in seasonal wind direction, and that would have an effect on forest water use, is something that I would like to look into a little bit more. Of course, we all know that hurricanes are increasing in frequency. I even with 26 named storms this year, I doubt that the number of hurricanes hitting the southeast is going to increase enough to increase water use because of wind direction. But other effects climatologically, like the polar vortex forming more often, or things like that, could definitely affect long-term trends in atmospheric water demand. And so are there implications for this research? Potentially. I would certainly welcome any ideas on that. We have tons of sat flow data here, and we have tons of climate data here, and are certainly interested in effects of climate change on tree water use. With that, I'd like to thank you and ask if you have any questions.
All right, thanks, Stephen, for the great talk. So we'll take questions through the chat. And if you guys have questions, you can enter them there. And Rachel Bosch and I will be reading those out, and we can discuss them. I can get us started out with a question while people are typing. So you've worked in places that have carbonates and don't have carbonates. And I'm kind of curious, as someone who works a lot with tree water usage, what you think some of the differences might be between those settings in patterns of tree water usage, or perhaps responses to these sorts of unusual events, comparing settings that say granite versus limestone, or whether maybe there are other factors that are more important.
Yeah, landscape position for trees is extremely important. And so where we work now is basically a flat landscape with vertical drainage. So, water comes into the system and basically goes straight down into the soils and into the substratum, the upper Florida aquifer. And so we always say, in this area on top of the Ocala limestone is basically deep sand. Almost all of our soils, even the ones with some clay content, have a lot of sand in them. And so with that type of drainage, we always say, we're never 2 weeks away from a drought. So we can see, if we get 2 weeks with no rainfall, we can see very rapid depression of sap flow or tree water use. Some trees actually do have access to groundwater. They can reach down maybe up to 10 meters deep with a taproot. And so they're less affected. Whereas in a site like with a impervious substratum, even with deeper soils, what you'll see is changes across the landscape based on elevation. So trees that are lower elevation will get a water subsidy from upslope. Trees that are upslope will lose water faster. And so that creates a more heterogeneous landscape in terms of the types of trees, the height of the trees, and even just the amount of water that's getting into the stream. Uh, so yeah, there are definitely differences depending on whether or not you're on a karst landscape or something that's more impervious. But maybe the major differences are in the topography. I guess does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. So we have a question, next question here from Chi Zhang. He says, "Hi, Stephen. Thank you for the talk. I have a few questions. One, have you considered alternative measurements that could provide sap flux at large spatial scale? Two, how is the tree water usage associated with groundwater flow, which I guess you just talked about a little bit. And three, as you mentioned, trees can take up water even under very high capillary pressure. Do you think it's worth to consider the water distribution in unsaturated weathered rock?"
Yeah, let me take those one at a time. The first one was remind me what the first question
Yeah.
was.
So, have you considered measurements of sap flux at large spatial scales?
Yeah, so we have actually four eddy covariance towers on site through some collaborators with University of Alabama, and what those towers do is measure total ecosystem exchange of water, and those basically confirm, what we learn on the ground, except that they're doing that at maybe a kilometer squared or a little smaller than that scale. So they incorporate the interception component, the tree water use, the ground cover water use, and so yeah, definitely we have a good feel for what total evapotranspiration is. The second question, remind remind me the second
Yeah.
question.
How is tree water usage associated with groundwater flow and resources?
Yeah, so this is fairly species dependent. Longleaf pine has or is known for having the potential to have very long tap roots. Like I said, I think that they've been measured down to 11 meters deep. And so with the shallow groundwater here, we definitely see evidence of groundwater usage in longleaf pine and also in some of the oak species. I think the only reservation I have about that, or problem I have about that, is that when groundwater does fluctuate, and it does fluctuate here fairly rapidly because of high agricultural usage, that those trees that become reliant on sap flux or on groundwater uptake from their taproot can be really hard hit during extreme droughts. So it's sort of a blessing and a curse for some of the species here. And if you compare longleaf pine that's grown in areas where there is really no access to groundwater, they're much slower growing trees than most of the trees on our site. And then the third question.
Right, was so trees can take up, as you mentioned, trees can take up water even under very high capillary pressure. Do you think it's worth to consider water distribution in unsaturated weathered rock?
Let me think about that. I mean, most of the water uptake is from unsaturated weathered rock or unsaturated soils. Roots can't really live below the water line very long. So what limits root depth oftentimes is the depth to sort of the shallowest depth you see in a year to groundwater. I think maybe one of the things that a lot of folks don't realize is that root turnover is much higher than above ground turnover. So leaves turnover once a year, fine roots will grow and then die back 3 or 4 times in a given year. And so the trees are very responsive to how wet those soils are. And if the saturated layer comes up too high, a lot of the fine roots actually die off.
Okay. Well, I don't see another question right now, so I will ask another question, which is thinking about the effect of fire on tree water usage. Are there likely long-term effects? Like if you compared a landscape where you had regular burning with a landscape that you didn't, would there be strong differences in the because of sort of the ecological shifts that would occur?
Yeah, sure. Fire is trees having to deal with fire. There's definitely a trade-off. There are negative consequences to fire in terms of tree health, but they're less impactful than the consequences of having a very high competition. So for longleaf pine, we have some sites here where we've excluded fire for almost 20 years now, and the amount of all the ground cover has disappeared. It's been replaced by shrubs, which are taking up nutrients and taking up water that the longleaf pine would have had access to normally. And then they also prevent the germination of new longleaf or the regeneration of new longleaf pine. So the ecosystem, in the absence of fire, within 100 years basically disappear. So the trade-off of having fire and dealing with the short-term stress of you know having to deal with heat moving across the surface of the soil is nothing compared to what you'll lose in the long term by not having fire.
Okay. Rachel, do you have a question? You normally have a question.
I normally have a question, but I'm not very questioning today.
Okay.
But that was an interesting talk. Thanks. There are a lot of things there. I'm not really a biologist at all, and so there were a lot of new things I never thought about before, like the tree root turnover. I had no idea. That's amazing.
Yeah, and
thank you.
To be honest, I sort of keep one leg in the ecology field and one in the hydrology field, and it's always nice to be able to talk to folks that are mainly physical hydrologists or just think about the rocks and the weather and the water, and to know that at least in some circumstances the biology can really have an effect. That's to me the sort of essence of eco-hydrology, is to cross those fields.
There was one thing I was thinking about. So you
Sure.
did talk about the large scale. I didn't quite capture how you do the large scale measurement.
Okay. There's basically a tower above the canopy. I think in our sites it's 110 feet. It's just a steel frame tower that has instrumentations on it that measure wind speed and direction and trace gases. And so the trace gases being CO2 and H2O. And so around the tower, basically there's a fetch area when blowing across these sensors, and you calculate what that fetch area is, and through the changes in trace gases, very fine scale, you can calculate the exchange of CO2 or the exchange of water coming from the forest. And the technique's called eddy covariance. And that basically you get a whole stand level estimate, or really measurement, of trace gas exchange from the ecosystem.
Okay, I'd like to ask a follow-up on that before we go on to our next question in the chat, which is something I was thinking about. Since it sounds like a couple of the main controlling factors are temperature and then the pressure gradient. within the tree. And I'm wondering if you could get at those less invasively and over a larger number of trees by, having sensors in the soil and then doing like infrared imagery, getting, the tops, the canopy of a large number of trees.
Yeah, those are great questions. The soil question, we actually have some test sites where we're measuring soil water loss over time, and using something called the white method. But basically you put soil moisture probes in the soil in a profile, and you measure how the soil releases moisture over time, and that is a good way to measure transpiration. Like you said, it's less invasive to the tree, but logistically, you have to dig a big soil pit. So we have sensors down to 1.5 meters. So you can measure stand level transpiration through soil moisture release. The infrared question is something that's definitely of interest to other folks. As trees transpire, they basically are absorbing radiant energy, or radiant energy is absorbed as water changes phases, and that's the area I think that's ripe for development. I'm not completely up to date in what's happened in that area in the last couple of years, but we've definitely had folks ask if they can put infrared sensors on some of our towers, to try to get at those questions of a non-invasive form of transpiration measurement. So yeah, you're definitely on the right track with both of those questions.
Cool. Okay, so we have another question in the chat from Laura Rosales. And she asks, going back to what you mentioned about the effect of climate change, as temperature may keep increasing in the Southwest or elsewhere, what is the threshold for trees to, I'm guessing, withstand these temperature changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's pretty complex. Like I said, when we're already pretty hot down here, 37 degrees Celsius is not unusual to hit during the day, and tree tissues are pretty susceptible to temperatures hotter than that. We actually killed some trees a few years ago just by elevating the temperature of the cambium with another type of probe. And it was during a drought, and the trees basically couldn't carry away that extra heat from the probe. And so they died, and we had several trees that we had sensors on die during this drought because of just a 6 or 7 degree increase in temperature of the cambium and not enough water to carry that heat away. So there's definitely the opportunity for some mortality as we go up in temperature over the next century. Probably what's going to happen before that, my guess would be, is that in the Southeast, at least, if lands aren't managed with prescribed fire, we're going to see more severe wildfires. We've seen that actually in the Okefenokee Swamp, which is to the east of us. And potentially, one of the one of the trends, I guess, a few years ago was people talking about the savannification of the Southeast. That forests in the Southeast, which are very productive now under a wet, moderately warm climate, are going to turn into savannas because there's not enough soil moisture to support, tree water use, and everything's going to turn into a grassland. That's actually something that we are okay with because longleaf pine is the natural state for much of the Southeast. There certainly would be some pain in terms of the forest industry, but in terms of the ecosystem that we manage, and longleaf pine being a low density with a lot of grass, warm season grass ground cover, that would probably be more of a return to historic conditions. So longleaf pine used to be 90 million acres across the Southeast, and now it's down to about 5. So I'm not going to say that we would welcome that. We want to have the choice to restore longleaf pine. But I think you would see that change before you would see, massive die-off of longleaf pine. But it's definitely something that we think longleaf pine is set up for in terms of restoration to try to get ahead of some of the climate change impacts that we'll see.
All right, we just had another question pop up in the chat. So let's see. Thanks for the talk. As water table shows a subdued replica of topography, can tree fire be controlled by manually changing topography? I think is. I think that's the question. It says by changing manually, by changing topography. I think by changing topography manually.
So sort of like sculpting the landscape.
I think that's the idea.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know how big a scale you could do that at. You could certainly maybe reinforce some of the wetlands. We have on our 30,000 acres, we have about 100 isolated wetlands, geographically isolated wetlands. We all know they're not truly isolated from the water table, but if potentially we could go in and take some of the sediment out and increase the hydrology, the hydro period of the wetlands, and that would certainly change the vegetation. I'm not sure how that would work across a larger landscape with groundwater. Yeah.
Yeah, it actually reminds me a little bit of a talk that I can't remember who gave it, a talk that I saw sometime in the last few years, where the title was something like constructing the critical zone. And they were working in I think it was a heavily impacted mine site that they were remediating, and they were trying to build back a sort of a terrain that would be closer to what was natural. So it was like sort of trying to construct the right topography and
it's an interesting
talk. I can't remember who gave it, but this is what it reminds me of.
Yeah, I'm much more of an ecologist than an engineer. So
yeah. Okay, well, with that, we're pretty much out of time here. So thanks again, Stephen, for the great talk, and thank you to everyone for attending, and hope to see you at the next talk.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and really enjoyed it.